Welcome friends, welcome back to the kitchen. So Julie and I just spent a week visiting family in the south, down in Arkansas. Spent a week at the cabin. And while we were there, my cousin shared this recipe with me. It's from an old cookbook, but it's not old enough to be part of the old cookbook show. This is from 1977. So it's kind of old, but it's not really that old. And I thought I wanted to do it anyway because when I first looked at it, it just seemed so outrageously strange. But then as I looked at it a little bit closer, I realized, no, this would work. This would work. There's elements here that really work, and I'll sort of talk through some of the reasoning along the way. But whoever came up with this, evil genius, I think. Evil genius. So in this pot, I have put butter. The recipe calls for oleo. In the context of this book, oleo means margarine. So you're supposed to use margarine. I don't keep margarine in the house. I can't bring myself to buy it, use it. Butter's going to be just fine. And if you look, butter is an ingredient in the next step anyway. So I don't know why they wanted you to use margarine and butter. Maybe it makes the cake healthier. So butter in the pot. Next in, 7-Up. So the 7-Up goes in. We'll talk about the 7-Up. And some cocoa powder. That goes in, and I'm supposed to bring this up to a boil. So 7-Up does a bunch of things in this cake. You can almost look at this like buttermilk. Strange, but true. So buttermilk always brings an acid, and that acid tenderizes the cake, tenderizes everything else that's going on. A lot of acid in any pop. This pop, I'm using 7-Up, but it could be Fanta, it could be Sprite, it could be Coke, it could be Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, root beer. Any of those would work in this. It's that acid component that it's bringing. Some people are going to say that it's bringing leavening. By the time you pour it in here, bring it to a boil, stir it together, none of the carbon dioxide is going to be left. There will be no leavening action from the pop. It'll simply be acid, sugar, and liquid. But that's why it works. The acid is why it works. Next into this, we're supposed to mix together the dry ingredients, which is an awful lot of sugar, an awful lot of sugar, and some flour. And so I'll just give this a stir to bring it together. And so there is no leavening, there's no salt. It's just flour and sugar. Those are the only dry ingredients. So I think that's mixed together. Let's check our pot. So this will stir up. I normally wouldn't just dump cocoa powder into a mixture like this because it will clump up and it will be very difficult to mix in. I'm kind of hoping that bringing this to a boil will help mix it together and you won't get those little clumps. I would normally leave the cocoa powder in that little bowl, pour in a tiny little bit of liquid and mix it into a paste. Adding a tiny little bit of liquid to cocoa powder rather than cocoa powder to a lot of liquid is an easier mix. So a little bit of put the cocoa powder in the bowl, leave it in the bowl, a little bit of liquid, back of a spoon, paste, and then put it in. Much better results. But I'm following the recipe. It said just dump it all into a pot, bring it to a boil. We'll see what happens. Now, tomato juice. Tomato juice. We need a half a cup of tomato juice. Now, a bunch of years ago on the channel, on the old cookbook show, we did tomato soup cake. And it works. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why it works. Tomatoes are full of, the popular term is umami. And the reason they're full of umami is they're full of glutamates. And glutamates is the G in monosodium glutamate. It just doesn't have the salt component. Glutamates exist naturally in a whole bunch of different things. Everything from seaweed, tomatoes, certain types of aged cheeses. All of those things have glutamates. And that's what makes them taste so amazing. And it's that glutamic acid. When I use Marmite or Vegemite in stews and stuff, it's that glutamic acid that really brings out all of the other flavors. That's in the tomato juice. That's going to really ramp up that chocolate flavor. It's going to work. It seems strange, but it really is going to work. So we'll mix the 2 eggs into the tomato juice, and then we'll check our chocolate mixture. It's just coming up to a boil. Over the last little while, vanilla, I have read a pile of articles where people are debating whether MSG has a place in baked goods. Yes. That's my answer. Yes, definitely has a place in baking. If you don't like MSG, that's fine. Don't use it. Avoid it. For those of us that like it, that have no problem with it, that, you know, it adds flavor to everything, I will use it in baking. If I hadn't chosen, oh, I can't find it. I usually have a big jug of it back there. If I hadn't chosen to do the cocktail series in the manner that I did Cocktails After Dark by looking at old cocktail books from, you know, pre-World War II, I'd be adding MSG to pretty much every cocktail that I make. Adds an incredible amount of flavor to your cocktails. So here we go. We just dump everything together. Liquid into the dry. I'll come back and scrape that a little bit better in a moment. Start to stir that together. In goes the tomato juice, egg, and vanilla. So I love vanilla. I absolutely love vanilla, but honestly, I'd have to say I think the vanilla is wasted in this mixture. I think there's so many other flavors going on here that you could leave that vanilla out and you're not going to miss it. Or use artificial vanilla. This is probably one of those places where using artificial vanilla would be just fine. Absolutely 100% just fine. So this is coming together as if there wasn't enough going on. Mini marshmallows. And you're supposed to dump those into the mixture and stir it all together. Okay, so I'm working from a picture of the recipe book. I've got it all mixed together. The next step, it says to bake in a flat pan 1 inch deep in a preheated 350-degree oven. So these are generally thought of as brownie pans, some people call them. I think I'm going to use the larger one. I don't think it will all fit in this one, but I think there might be a typo. Earlier I said there's no leavening. When you read the ingredient list, there's no leavening listed. Mix together sugar and flour. Heat cocoa, 7-Up, and oleo to boiling. Pour over flour mixture. Add tomato juice, eggs, soda, vanilla, and marshmallows. Do they mean baking soda? I know in the United States they call 7-Up as a soda, but we already added that to the cocoa and the butter. Is there a leavening component? And how much would there be? Probably a teaspoon and a half of baking soda, which would make sense because it would react to the acid in the 7-Up. But if it's like a brownie, it doesn't have leavening. The best brownies I've ever eaten have no leavening. I'm going to go no leavening. Okay, so we're going to pour it into this pan. I should probably call these segments Mistakes Were Made. Because, you know, mistakes were made. So, a couple things. I don't think this is big enough. I'm going to put this on another baking sheet because I can pretty much guarantee it's going to bubble over. Mixing all of the marshmallows in here means that they're all clumped together. And I think it would be having never made this before, I'm just surmising. I'm making stuff up as I go along. I think it would probably be better not to mix the marshmallows into the batter, but to sprinkle the marshmallows evenly on top of the cake before you slip it into the oven. So I'm just going to try and spread these out a little bit so they're not all kind of clumped in the corners. And into the oven. 350, about a half hour. Okay, the cake is cooked. I'm going to pull it out and we'll make the icing. We're supposed to put the icing on while it's still hot. It's not going to cool down very quickly. So in this pot, I'm going to put the butter, cocoa, and tomato juice. And we'll just melt that together. We'll just give that a bit of a stir. Take a bit for that butter to melt. And then icing sugar. I'm only making half of the icing recipe because I often find there's just too much icing. So half is fine for me. If you want to make the whole icing recipe, go right ahead. Now we mix the butter, cocoa, tomato juice. We mix that into the icing sugar. I'm just using a rubber spatula. I think it'll be fine. The recipe calls for 1 box of icing sugar. That's not how icing sugar is sold here. And I've always found that with any icing recipe, you really need to add a little bit more or a little bit less every time you make it. It's not quite the same. So in this case, if you're going to do a whole box of icing sugar, make sure that you have some extra icing sugar on hand if you need to add a little bit more. And maybe start off with a little bit less than a full box. In case you don't need, in case you, in this day, on the day that you're making it, you don't need to use the whole amount. It's just one of those things that it's always variable. Now, it tells me to put pecans in here before you pour it onto there. I'm going to pour it onto there and then sprinkle the pecans on top. So on with the icing. And this is a cake that I'm actually going to enjoy putting the icing on because it's just a sheet pan and you don't have to get fancy. And sprinkle the pecans on top. So now I'll just set this aside, let it cool, and when Julie gets home from work, we'll give it a taste. I probably should have.
Hey, friends, is that fudge?
Well.
Oh, no, it looks like cake with a very fudgy icing. Is there a separate icing or does it separate out?
It is a separate icing.
Oh, I had thought maybe it was one of those, you pour it all in and you end up with a fudgy icing. Ooh.
So the recipe was, I think it was missing something because there's no leavener in it. And there was no leavener in the ingredient list, but in the method it mentioned when you put in the soda.
Did you?
I didn't. I left it out.
Oh.
So I think it needs the soda.
Yeah, it's a strange texture, huh?
Yeah. Definitely needs soda.
It's more like a jelly.
Mm-hmm. It's tomato aspic cake.
A thick tomato aspic? You just want to say aspic, didn't you?
Yes, it's a thick tomato aspic cake.
With some chocolate added.
It is a product of the 1970s. Okay, so it needs leavener. But I don't know if the leavener would actually help the flavor. The tomato really does come through.
Yeah.
The tomato really does come through. So everything that I said earlier about how well this cake should work, I was mostly wrong.
Although it could have been you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that's the end of it. That's as much as I can do. It's got all those things you like, right? It's sugary, it's a bit chocolatey, but it is a strange texture and...
It is very sweet, too. It is very sweet.
Not quite right. Close, but not quite right.
If you are adventurous and you want to give this a shot, I would put 1.5 teaspoons of baking soda in this.
Or maybe you've got a couple other suggestions that might save it.
Yeah, I mean, it does need some leavening.
But I don't think that would change, like I really don't think that would change the texture very much.
Well, most of the brownie recipes that I really like don't have much, if any, leavening in them.
Oh, this is a brownie.
Well, no, it's a cake.
Okay.
It
Yeah,
is
I'm confused.
Yeah, no.
Fudge,
it is.
jelly, brownie, cake.
It was the 70s, man. Lots of people were confused.
Maybe that's the ingredients that's missing.
As a child who lived through the 70s, I mean, I'm sure that this is something that passed over our table at some point or something like this.
Yeah, well, you know, well, yeah, because I remember things like mayonnaise cake and yeah.
Mayonnaise cake was really good, though.
It was really good. And maybe we've made another cake with like pop in it.
Yes, we made a Coca-Cola cake, and that was really good.
I think we made another cake with tomato.
We made a tomato soup cake, and you couldn't.
I can
taste
always
the tomato.
remember the cake.
You could not taste the tomato in that. This needs leavening to improve the texture. I don't know if it would improve the flavor, but as you can see, we've set down the cake, and we're not going back for a second piece. So, not a winner. Jean-Vé, there's your answer. I know that you were interested in what this cake was going to turn out like.
Not so good.
There's your answer.
But you know, we tried.
Thanks for stopping by. See you again soon. I might pick all the pecans off the top. That's a terrible waste of pecans.
I know. Did you want to do that before you take your hero shot?
No, no.
No.